Hey guys, this is it. One of the last lessons that we're going to take a look at is something called the quadratic formula. Now, we spent the first video of this lesson talking a little bit about quadratic equation and how you can solve a quadratic equation. And one of the things we looked at was that you could solve this equation here by making sure it was set equal to 0 and then go ahead and factoring that thing and setting the factors equal to 0, etc. In fact, actually, let me go through this thing. It's already set equal to 0, so that's done. So now what I want to do is I want to factor that. So I'm looking for numbers that multiply to be 12 and combine to be 4, add or subtract to be 4. It's going to be 6 and 2. To get that to be a positive 4, it's going to have to be positive 6 and negative 2. Now, those are my factors. Those aren't my answers. I now have to set my factors equal to 0 and solve for x. And like most quadratics, not every one, but most quadratics, we end up with two answers to this thing. X is 2, and x is equal to negative 6. Now, what was nice about this quadratic equation was this thing factored. Once I said equal to 0, I had a polynomial there that could factor. And that the fact that it can factor, then I can solve the rest of it pretty easily. Well, not every polynomial can factor. So that's why there's a need to be able to solve a quadratic equation some other way. And that's where the quadratic formula comes into play. Now, look at the size of that thing. There's the formula. X equals negative b plus or minus. That's what that symbol means. When you see this symbol here, that symbol means plus or minus. The square root of b squared minus 4ac, and then that whole thing gets divided by 2a. Now, besides the fact that you're probably overwhelmed at how big this formula is, the next thing you might ask yourself is, where do I get those values for a, b, and c? Remember, those are going to come from the quadratic equation. Once that equation is in standard form, a is the number in front of x squared, b is the number in front of x, and c is just the constant number at the end. So we plug all those things in, then it's just a matter of doing the math. But typically, you're going to use this formula when something can't be factored. Now, before we do that, I just want to show you the last one we did that we factored. I want to show that one using the quadratic formula, just so you see we get the same answers. Remember, the two answers we got were x is negative 6 and x is 2. Okay, so here is the, oh no, I don't want to go to this. Sorry, guys, back to here. Okay, let's not play that song. There's a whole song to remember this whole formula. Anyway, you can see all my work done there. Ignore that for a second here. Here's the quadratic equation that we're going to solve. It's the same one we just looked at a minute ago. And the first thing I need to do is identify a, b, and c. A is 1. That's the number in front of x squared. B is positive 4. And c is negative 12. You'll see in this first step that I've now substituted all those values in where they belong. Okay, so that's sort of, I guess, why do these windows keep popping up? That's step 2. Substitute all the values in for A, B, and C. Okay, really important. You notice I use parentheses when I substitute it in. That way I don't get confused with positives and negatives and addition and subtraction signs. So just a little easier that way. And now it's just a matter of doing the math, evaluating. Now, there's a couple steps that I skipped here, okay, going from here to here. So let me just show them off on the side real quick, and I'll show them when we do one together anyway. But 4 squared, that was 16. And then negative 4 times 1 is negative 4 times negative 12 was positive 48. When I add those together, that's how I got that 64 there. So square root of 64. Now remember, the square root of 64 has two answers, 8 and negative 8. And that's where this symbol comes into play here. So at this point, I've now separated the problem into two answers. one where I use positive 8 and one where I use negative 8. And, we finished doing the math and look at the two answers we get. They're the exact same answers that we got when we did it by factoring. Now, that's just you looking at one already done. Let's do one together. Now, what's going to be different about the one we do together is that it's not going to factor. So you're going to see the real reason why we use this. Now, have your calculator handy. I have mine down here that I'm going to use when we need to. But just have that ready to go. All right, here comes the problem. Use the quadratic formula to solve the following quadratic equation. X squared plus 3x minus 8. Well, let me write down the quadratic formula. X equals, now I've memorized this. The square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2 times a. You can simply keep going back and looking at it if you need to. Okay. Now I'm going to get a, b, and c from my original equation. A is right here. So that's 1. B is right here. So that's 3. And C is right here at the end. That's negative 8. So now let's substitute all of those numbers in. Start to do the math. Negative B, so that's going to be negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 3 squared. Notice that I'm putting that in parentheses. Minus 4 times 1 times negative 8 all over 2a. Well, 2 times 1. Okay, now I'll do the stuff inside the parentheses a little slower this time. Negative 3 plus or minus, that's a 3 by the way, plus or minus the square root of, now, negative 3 squared is 9. Now over here we have negative 4 times 1 times negative 8. That's going to give me positive 32. All of that is going to be over 2. 2 times 1 is 2. Now, let's put the work up here now. So now we have x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 41 over 2. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to go right to my calculator and find out first what is, and let me go to my screen where I can do some calculating. What is negative 3 plus the square root, so I hit second x squared, that'll bring up the square root of 41. So this is me doing the plus version of it. I get that, divide that by 2. I end up with an answer of 1.7. So one of my answers is x is equal to 1.7. Let's do the other version where we subtract the square root of 41. So negative 3 minus the square root of 41. Now I'm going to divide that by 2, and I end up with 4.7, negative 4.7. Notice that I rounded both my answers to the nearest tenth. You're going to hear next year, sometimes you'll round it to the nearest tenth. Sometimes you actually leave the radical there. That the radical is the square root symbol. Sometimes you'll just leave it. So actually, sometimes you'll just stop and leave your answer like that, and that'll be the end of it. But in our case, we went a step further. We rounded to the nearest tenth, and we did the math. And there's our two answers. So no wonder this didn't factor. Look at those answers. They're decimal values. Okay. Well, that's it. I mean, I wanted to at least get a chance for you to see this and to try this. You're going to have one problem for your homework tonight. That'll be due on Thursday. Remember, Friday is our makeup day, and all grades need to be handed in on Friday. So just make sure. Okay? All right. Good luck.